It is on. Hi guys, welcome to the first day of Dreamforce. How was your day so far?
Great.
Awesome, there we go. I like that guy. So I'm Marcus Torres. I've been at Salesforce for a little over 4 years. And I've done platform, I've done mobile, I do Lightning platform. And for all of you that follow kind of the MVP world, I used to work with Shannon Hale, which I see right there. Hi, Shannon. How are you? You know, today we're really talking about how we're improving the Lightning UI platform or the Lightning UI so that everyone in this room can continue to develop or start to hopefully develop great new experiences in Lightning. As you know, Lightning is the future of how you customize UI in Salesforce. And one of the things that has been pretty clear and something we're constantly trying to do is make it so that developing and innovating yourself is as easy as possible. And so how many of you are familiar with Visualforce? Sweet, I love this room. In Visualforce, how many of you are familiar with, of course, the standard controller? Of course, all the same hands. So, as you know, the standard controller does a lot of great work for you. Ton of work, everything from kind of navigation to CRUD operations to data binding, data retrieval, all those kind of things. And we realize that that's something similar we want to bring to Lightning and to you. And so one of the things we first must start off with, and you guys have been with Salesforce long enough to know this slide, it is no longer called the safe harbor slide, it is a forward-looking statement slide, and you know what it means. Make all buying decisions based on current functionality and nothing in the future, and we will be talking about the future in this presentation, so there you go. All right. With kind of the modernization of latest UI frameworks, right, is many of them, or most of them, if not all of them, are component-based, right? So really about leveraging components. So in these modern mobile experiences, you can have multiple components in a single view. You have nested components. Nested components are also about reuse, right? Reuse and the ability to really kind of create these very slick experiences all with kind of individual components. But these components share data. So for an example, here's obviously our Lightning desktop experience. And everything that I highlighted is essentially a duplicate set of data. Because in Lightning today, every component actually maintains or keeps its own copy of the data. And that brings me to the eventing. So if you have tried developing in Lightning, you know that you essentially have change handlers for any time records change. And this is a bunch of work that you essentially have to code. And of course, all of the kind of CRUD operations from actually going and loading your record to saving your record, any kind of create or delete, all is being managed through code today. And this is, common patterns you would face in frameworks. So, I was scared for a second. It's not just me. Okay, so with the Lightning, let's go through the Lightning component framework today. If the ceiling falls, I apologize. With the Lightning components today, let's just kind of walk through the flow. So on the left-hand side, what you see is the Lightning desktop home. And kind of feel like one of those hotels with the 25-cent like bed or something, it's kind of weird. So anyways, there's the Lightning home, and on the right-hand side, I want to create my own custom component, right? Something to visualize this. And so here, of course, you're going to write your component, and that's markup, really. And then that component has a JavaScript controller. That JavaScript controller has essentially all of your various component methods. But today, that's going to call Apex, and you're going to write that Apex controller. Most likely in Apex, you're going to have a bunch of SOCL to do the initial loading, to do the saving or the kind of the upsert of your data. And that's going to talk to Salesforce, of course, and our infrastructure. And that's going to flow all the way back. But the reality is every single one of these steps is custom code for you today. You have to write this, everything from the component to the JavaScript controller to the Apex to the sockle. But a lot of these operations are pretty much boilerplate. And so where we're really going with the Lightning Data Service and in the winter release, you can call that through what we call Force Record Preview. Here's a note, it's Dev Preview. You have that same custom component, but instead of calling a JavaScript controller that then calls an Apex controller and so forth, what you're going to do is just use that component, and it's going to essentially do a bunch of things for you. So caching is one of the areas that, or one of the services that provides XHR optimization. So now that if you have this single view with multiple components all asking and kind of requesting similar data, there's overlap there, right? But we also want to bundle that together. So if someone is requesting 5 fields and another person is requesting, say, the full layout, and another person is requesting the compact layout and so forth and so on, that we really combine that as a single operation when we go and we load that record. And then because of caching, and actually Lightning Data Service is kind of the foundation in which our offline capabilities are built, we also have the ability to deal with drafts. And drafts is really about if you have a given record and for whatever reason, this is all client side, right? So if you have this given record and there's a change being made, that we can actually save and persist that version of the record different or essentially on the client. And so on the right-hand side, instead of every single component having its own copy of the data, now they all share a single source of truth, essentially a single shared cache. And the even better thing about this is Salesforce components, like the ones you see on the page there, actually leverage Lightning Data Service as well. So this is something we've been actually our internal teams develop and leverage for their own components. And your custom components can work the same way and kind of leverage that same single shared source of truth. So what are some of the features and the benefits of Lightning Data Service? So one, automatic record loading from Salesforce. The CRUD operations automatically happen because we essentially have, as part of that component methods for essentially getting the record, loading the record, saving the record, deleting the record, and even getting a new record, which the team's going to walk you through in a second. You don't have to write Apex or Sockle anymore, which is pretty awesome. And how many of you have written code to respect field level security or access checks? Right? This is crazy. We should just do that for you. That's kind of our pattern. So Lightning Data Service actually respects all of those access controls, so you don't have to do it. When data changes, your components are automatically notified, and so you see those updates in real time, and you don't have to manage that eventing. Components can be entity agnostic, which is pretty cool. A lot of Apex controllers, obviously they are specific to the entity you're on, and if you think kind of Visualforce and you use a controller, it's very specific to that entity. But now components can essentially work across various object types. And last but not least, because of the caching and the draft capabilities that are just kind of built into Lightning Data Service, in Salesforce 1, we have a persistent cache, essentially a persistent storage to handle all the caching. And so your component and your customization can now work offline directly within the app. So think of that. You've decided to introduce a new component or potentially customize an existing view within Salesforce 1, and it can now work offline just simply by leveraging the service. So enough about slides, and I'm going to turn it over to Carolyn and Ed. Both are on the Lightning Data Service team here internally, and they're going to actually walk you through code, which is much better than my slides.
Thanks, Marcus. Hi, everyone. My name is Carolyn Grable. I'm a software engineer on the Lightning Data Service team.
Hi. Don't have a mic, but I'm there.
Ed Lee, also an engineer on Lightning Data Service team. We're going to walk you through a demo we wrote that uses force record preview in 2 custom components. We're going to be using the Dreamhouse application, which you might have seen demoed at other demos here at Dreamforce. We're using it all over. The scenario here is we are real estate brokers, and we have properties in our organization. We want to sell properties. We want to make appointments for our clients to see those properties. So let's drill into a property record. And on that property layout, we have 2 custom components that are using force record preview. The first one is this property path along the top. It looks a lot like the standard lead and opportunity sales path, which come standard with Lightning Experience. But this is a custom component written entirely on the platform. And it uses force record preview to share data between that custom component and the standard details component. The property path is driven off the status field. Similarly, you can still see we have status and details. So the same data, as Marcus was saying, is replicated in more than one place on the record. Since we're seeing the same data in more than one place, we want both of those places to reference a single source of truth. That's what Lightning Data Service is going to do for you. This component also performs edits of the record. So if we click on another value in that path, it's going to perform a save, and we'll see that it also updated on the other place we see that data. So Lightning Data Service keeps the data in sync between the components. Shall we go to the code and look at the definition of this component? We're going to open this up in the developer console. What I want to point out first is that there are 2 main parts of this component. The first is the force record preview component. The second is the process component. We've obfuscated all of the UI into the process component, and we'll be talking mostly about force record preview. Force record preview is a little unique in that it doesn't actually render any UI. You might think at first, like, oh, it makes a preview of a record. It's actually just a hook into the Lightning Data Service API. Let's go through all of the properties on this component. The first one is the Aura ID. We need to set an Aura ID so that we can find this component and reference it from JavaScript. So this Aura ID is record service, and you want to remember that. We'll come back to that later. The second property is the record ID, the ID of the record that we want to load. And we get that for free because this component implements the force has record ID interface. When you implement that interface and you drop a component into a record homepage using the Lightning App Builder, we'll automatically pass in the ID of the record that you are in the context of. So we get that for free. We don't have to declare an Aura attribute for record ID. So we know that record ID is going to be the ID of the property that we're currently viewing. The next attribute is target record. Target record is going to be a reference to an object attribute in this component. So for here, we created an attribute called record. Its type is object. And once Lightning Data Service loads the record, it'll put it in that attribute. So that's what we'll use to reference it later. Next, we have to tell it what fields we want. Just like in a SOQL call, you would say select the fields you want from entity. Here we have to tell Lightning Data Service, these are the fields we want on the record. Another option is to use a layout type. You could use full for everything that the admin said should be in the page layout. You could use compact for everything that should be in the highlights panel. But for this example, we're going to predefine some fields. Next is the mode. Mode tells us whether or not you intend to make changes to this record. Since this component does a save when you click on something, we'll use edit mode. Edit means we're going to make changes. The other option is view. If we don't plan to make any changes, then we can say view mode is good, that'll be enough. And then when Lightning Data Service sees that there are new values for the record, it can automatically re-render our component. For edit mode, you might have some in-progress edits you don't want to be clobbered by new updates, so we won't automatically update your record if you're in edit mode. And the last property is an event that is fired when Lightning Data Service gets new values for the record updated event. So we'll set that to the name of a function in our JavaScript controller. Let's look at that function definition. I said since we're in edit mode, Lightning Data Service isn't going to automatically overwrite our data. So if we want to pull in new data, which we do, if the user edits this record in the detail panel, in the regular details section and hit save, we still want our component to be updated. So here we'll find record service. I said, remember that Aura ID. This is how we're going to use it. We do component.find, the name of our force record preview component. And once we've found it, we can call methods on it. And it has several methods. This is part of our force record preview API. So we're going to call this save record method. And that's going to take all of the attributes that are all of the fields on the object that's in the target record attribute and perform a save. And that's all we have to do a save. Let's go back to the demo and look at the other component that uses force record preview. So we have a small component that's going to create appointments related to this property record. And this is going to create new records. So we want those new records to be related to the current property record. Just like contacts are a child of account, appointments are going to be a child of properties. When we clicked create appointment, a modal popped up. And this is the component that we'll be talking about that I'll be showing you the code for in a minute. We have some default field values. And these are not default field values that are hard-coded into our UI. Has anyone ever had to hard-code default field values into UI? I hate doing that. I have to see at least 2 hands. Awesome. I'm going to be able to save you from that. These field values are coming from the admin-defined field values for the record we're creating. So we'll enter some data and hit create, and we'll see a property record, an appointment record being created. There it is. So it popped up in our list of appointments related to this property. But not only can we do successful saves, we can do unsuccessful saves. Maybe there's a validation rule. In this organization, I have a validation rule on appointment date, that you cannot create a new appointment in the past, which makes sense. So let's set this appointment date and time to last Saturday and try to create. We're going to get a field validation error. And that field validation error is going to be associated with the field that has the error. Shall we go back to the code? This component is called create related record. And we have all of the code for this demo in a GitHub repo, and we'll put up the link at the end over questions. This component has a few more properties, but just like the property path component, it uses force record preview. The main difference between this usage of force record preview and the previous one is that we're not passing a record ID in. We don't have a record ID yet. We haven't created any records yet. We're going to use this to create new records. But the rest of the inputs are the same. The Aura ID, we have to set a target record. We can also set a target error, which will be populated with any errors on load in case this user doesn't have access to that entity or in case the record was deleted before the load could happen. And we're still going to be in edit mode. We'll still hard code some fields. Let's see. Once we've set target record to record for create, oh, can we go back to the markup? We've set target record to record for create. So once that record's been loaded, I can reference it in my UI markup. So at the bottom, we have an input date time, and we have an input text. And we've set the values for both of those inputs to values on the fields. So for input date time, its value is going to be the record's appointment date. And for the input text, it's going to be the client name. Since we didn't have a record ID and we're not loading an existing record on initialization, what we want to happen what we want to have happen on initialization instead is to load an empty record template that contains all of the admin-defined default values for this kind of record. So since we're not having that automatically handled on force record preview, we have a handler for init on this component. And when that handler is called, it calls our controller init function. Let's take a look at that init function. I think the earth shattering did something with with our demo. So our init function has one call. It calls to our helper. Our helper is going to get that empty record template. Let's look at that helper definition. The first thing getNewRecord is going to do, just like the previous component, it's going to find the force record preview using its Aura ID. Once we've found it, we can call the methods on it. The method we're going to call is getNewRecord. That will populate target record with that empty record template. We pass a few parameters into getNewRecord. The first is the entity API name. We can also pass in a record type ID or another map of default field values in case we do want to hardcode some default data into this component. And the last parameter we pass in is a callback. And that callback will be invoked once the empty record template has been fetched. And in that callback, we can handle success or error on getting that record template. Here, if we have success, since I know that I'm creating a record that's going to be a child of the property, I'll go ahead and set the master detail field to the ID of the property that I'm looking at. I know that my users won't be able to change that, but if you wanted to have a UI that they could change that, you could do that. By default, we're going to hardcode it to the property that they're looking at currently. So that all happens on component initialization. Now let's talk about what happens when the user clicks the create button, when we want to actually perform a save. And that's going to be in the controller for this component. When the user clicks save, it's going to call this create appointment function. Just like all the other components, just like all the other functions that use force record preview methods, the first thing it has to do is find the record service, find the force record preview component by its Aura ID, its record service, and then we'll call the save record method. The property path component didn't pass in any callback to save record, but we will in this case because we want to handle success and error and all the possible states that could happen. All the states that could happen are the same as other Aura actions if you're calling to an Apex controller. Possible states are success, error, and incomplete in case you're on a BART train, you're under the bay, and you can't reach the cloud. You might get a state of incomplete. But Lightning Data Service has one more state than standard Aura actions do. That state is draft. As Marcus said, sometimes if you can't reach the server and the device supports it, a record might be saved locally on the client as a draft. And draft state should be handled similarly to success. Maybe you want to show a slightly different toast. Maybe you want to say a pending record update has been created. But in this example, I'm going to handle it the same way as I handle success. We'll pop up a toast message to say a record has been successfully created. And then at the end of this if block, we'll call helper.getNewRecord again to get another empty record template so that we're ready to create the next new record. That's all if the save was successful. But if the save was unsuccessful, if there was an error, then we need to get the errors out of that save result object. We get the error from the save result object, and then we check the value of the field errors. Each field error is indexed by field API name. So we can check if each one exists, for each field, if there is an error, we'll find it and add it to our UI form. All right. I'll hand it back over to Marcus.
Awesome. Thanks, Caroline. Thanks, Ed. So what you can see is instead of having to write a bunch of code or controllers or server-side controllers in SOCL, now we're just going to handle a bunch of those things for you. But I'm sure you just don't want to stop with one record. You want to get a collection of records. And so let's talk a little bit about our roadmap. So one of the things we want to do is get Lightning Record out so you can actually start using it. Now, you'll notice something here. It's called Lightning Record all of a sudden. And before several slides and what you've seen in the code is it's called Force Record Preview. That's for a reason. Later in your spring release, we're going to be changing all of the namespaces. to all have Lightning. And so we need to fall in line with that, which kind of sucks for you guys because I had originally purchased all these t-shirts that said use the Force record, which was much cooler than Lightning record. So you don't get those, but this is the right pattern for us going forward. The next is really looking at a lot of this is around doing the data handling for you and having certain component methods so you can do CRUD operations and kind of all the other benefits of the data service, which is really dealing with kind of that, the overlaying data. But what if you just wanted the UI? You didn't want to have to worry about the data or the UI. And you just said, here's a bunch of fields. You know what my layouts are. You know what these field types are. You know what default components you typically use. Just generate it for me. Just make it, I'm going to give you the field names and just do both the data handling and the display. That way you don't have to write components for the UI. That way you don't have to use base components and kind of stitch it together yourself and just handle it. So that's something that is coming from the platform. Next is we want you to be able to use this outside Salesforce 1 and the Lightning desktop experience. Today and within both the winter release and the spring release, you will need to be within the desktop in Salesforce 1 to leverage Force Record Preview, which will then become Lightning Record. And we want to get rid of that. And then next is really about Lightning Record Collection. Maybe we'll call it something slightly different. Maybe it's just Lightning Records. Who knows? We'll figure that out. But here is the chance for you to actually retrieve a whole set of records. So imagine you passed us just your query string, and we'll go do all the handling for you. Or a list view ID, or any kind of list or an ID that represents a list. Related list is a good example as well. We'll just go and fetch that for you automatically, and you don't have to write anything. And then last but not least is server triggered updates. Where we're fundamentally going, I think as an overall platform, is as you have changes to your metadata and as you have changes to your data, we are essentially streaming that information down to the client. So your components aren't having to check or essentially do these calls at all, but we're essentially coming down with the latest information. This way, if you have your cache, or essentially this single source of truth, which is your cache data, if we see an update from another user and another client or an API call that updates it, we can actually send that update directly to the client. So with that, we have about 10 minutes left, and I want to just open it up to you for any questions to the team on the Lightning Data Service and kind of your thoughts. There's a microphone right in the middle if you want to ask that.
What's the limit of the data cache?
Can you, sorry.
I wanted to check what's the limit on the data cache, like how much data you can store on the service.
The limit on the cache?
Yeah.
So we don't really have like a limit in the way you think of kind of traditional Apex limits. On the client, it's really the storage on the client for Salesforce 1. For the desktop, is there a limit on the desktop?
It's sized right now by megabytes. So, and we're still working out the exact number, but so if your records are big, you'll have less records. If you have small records, you'll have more. And we'll be constantly like refreshing or pulling out or kicking out the old stuff.
How you guys manage the cache? It's first in, first out, or what is the lifetime of the records in the cache?
First in, first out.
Okay.
First a clarification and then a question. So right now it's Force Record Preview, generally available, right?
Available in developer preview. So it's on in all developer edition orgs that have Winter 17.
Okay. And then spring, it's going to be,
It'll still be developer preview in spring. The broader changes we're making, we expect to be in summer of next year.
okay.
Now, between now and then, you obviously part of why we're presenting is we want you guys to try it and integrate it and see if it works. And then you can always reach out to me in this case if you want to enable it for a different instance, because when it's in dev preview, you can't package it and essentially install it across your orgs using packaging.
And then a separate question. Is there going to be availability differences between communities and standard Salesforce? Will it roll out for communities later or at the same time?
Right now, there's no restriction that we have for communities, so we would expect it to roll out at the same time.
Thank you.
Sure.
Adam, you may have said it. The standard controller in Visualforce includes security, field level security, et cetera. Does the data service support security as well, completely? Cool.
Sure. Excuse me, you had a...
Yeah, I went to a talk earlier about the locker service, and it was talking about how namespaces was kind of segregated between components. Is the data that we showed shared in the cache? Does that also have to be within one namespace, or does the data get seen by multiple namespaces of the components with the locker service?
Locker service doesn't have an impact like you're describing. The data will be shared among all components that want a hook to the same record.
Okay.
Any more questions?
So I'd asked you this question earlier as well. So I'm more of a business user. I'm not a tech guy. So we have customers for whom we have built Visualforce pages to work on mobile. So let's say you have a product configurator. Now, because I can't have that offline, if I build that page using LDS, would we be able to build some of those pages to work in offline mode?
Yeah, the benefit of the Lightning Data Service within the Salesforce One app, so if you build that component, all of the caching mechanism works just like our other components within Salesforce One, and it will cache it and it will be available for you offline. Visualforce will never be offline.
But so whether my page has, let's say it's referencing 5 to 6 objects, that wouldn't matter, right? Like in Salesforce One, it only allows you most recently used objects. For custom components, there would be no such limit.
The data would have to be retrieved while you are offline, but once that data is in the cache, you can access records of any object offline.
So let's say if I'm making a quote in an offline mode through a configurator, so if data for making the code is available offline, I'll be able to do it.
If it's been viewed once and you're coming back to it while
Correct.
offline, then yes, you can do that.
Okay.
Yeah, in the longer term, we would think about ways for customizations to essentially indicate to us it's intended to work offline. So we could potentially add that to the syncing mechanism, but that's further down the line. But as long as it was viewed once, then obviously we have your component definitions and everything we need for it to work client side. And of course, we would have the data from retrieving it the first time.
Sure, thanks.
Or the last time in that matter.
Hi. How will you handle data validation while using the draft mode? Like, it will be a further event that will tell you, like, because you have the draft state, so you have this message like pending, saving, whatsoever. But if anything in the backend fails, how does that work?
So the question is, if the draft is unable to be saved when the client comes back online, how is that handled? Is that the question?
Yeah, exactly.
So we have a mechanism in the syncing util that will display all of the different pending updates that you have. And some of them might be pending their first attempt to sync. Some of them might be pending, we tried to sync, but then there were conflicts with other records that were, or with other edits that were done while the client was offline. And then there's a third category for pending records that could not be saved for other reasons. And so there's a way to dismiss from the same client that you performed the edit on.
Okay.
Yeah, then you can click into it and make any modifications if you need to, and you can save it again.
Any more questions?
What is the criteria to get it to the cache? They have to view the record previously so that it's the cache, or it's
Viewing the record will add it to the cache.
cache, so there is no other mechanism to add it to the cache.
If you wanted to use Force Record Preview to perform a load but then not render any UI, there's nothing stopping you from doing that also.
Okay, so we can load it, and then without any front-end display, we can still load it.
That's correct.
For Salesforce one, I think there's a default set of like entities in your most recently used that gets loaded. So maybe your user won't have to load it explicitly, and they'll still be able to view it offline.
Cool. Well, thank you for coming, and hopefully you enjoy your guys'